All right. Peace, peoples. I think we on. Let me make sure. I didn't know it's normally 5 seconds. Edit this if I'm talking over the beginning. People are joining. All right. Peace, peace. My name is Reggie Blanding, and I'm a librarian in the James Brown African American Room, aka J-Bar, here in Newark, New Jersey, at the Newark Public Library. On behalf of our director, Ingrid Betancourt, and Board of Trustees President, Dr. Lauren Wells, we thank you all for joining us this evening. For anyone joining us for the first time, J-Bar was named in honor of the late James Library Brown, who was an influential librarian, poet, and activist. Mr. Brown was instrumental in ensuring the library curated books, resources, and presented programs that examined and celebrated the African American experience. He was also committed to urging Newark youth to pursue education and to understand the importance of the library's role in their academic growth. We aim to continue his work and his vision. As always, we would like to take this time to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape First Nations on which we are learning, laboring, and organizing today. We're aware it is Native American Heritage Month. We often give this acknowledgement out, yes, throughout the year. And as I say, with Black History Month, there's a rich wellspring of culture and history there that 28 to 30 days cannot compress. So, you know, while we say month, this is a year round that we do these studies, that we study, we learn, we build. So, but acknowledging Newark or Native American Heritage Month is this month for those who don't know. And this is going to be part of that. We also continue to recognize the devastation and continued legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, which contributed to present day systemic racism and oppression. And we stand in solidarity with those who continue to fight against its unjust reach. Speaking of, let me introduce tonight's esteemed guests. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Kyle Mays. Dr. Mays is an associate professor of African American Studies, American Indian Studies, and History at University of California, Los Angeles, aka UCLA. He is a transdisciplinary scholar of urban history and studies, Afro-Indigenous studies, and contemporary popular culture. He is the author of several books, including Hip Hop Beats, Indigenous Rhymes, Modernity, and Hip Hop in Indigenous North America. His most recent book is City of Dispossessions, Indigenous Peoples, African Americans, and the Creation of Modern Detroit, Politics and Culture in Modern America. And of course, the inspiration for tonight's program, the wonderful An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. You can follow Dr. Mays on his website, www.kyle-mays.com, or on his Twitter. Can I blow up the Twitter? Twitter's all right. Share all that. Some people keep their Twitters private. I have the thumbs up. At now I'm messing it up. I have to ask permission. At Mays_Kyle. So Brother Mays, we thank you and we appreciate you joining us tonight. I'm equally honored to welcome Amber Starts, AKA, I love this, Melanin Muskogee. And when we say Melanin Muskogee, I just want to say MVSKOKE. So remember it that way. She is an Afro-Indigenous advocate, organizer, cultural critic, decolonial theorist, and budding abolitionist. She is an enrolled citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation and is also of Shawnee, please forgive me if I mispronounce anything here, Yuchi Quapaw, and Cherokee descent. Her passion is the intersection of Black and Native American identity. Her activism seeks to normalize, affirm, and uplift the multidimensional identities of Black and Native peoples through discourse and advocacy around anti-Blackness, abolishing blood quantum, Black liberation, and indigenous sovereignty. Oh my goodness. That's why I had water beforehand. Try to. She hopes to encourage Black and Indigenous peoples to prioritize one another and divest from compartmentalizing struggles. She ultimately believes the partnerships between Black and Indigenous peoples and all people of color will aid in the dismantling of anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and settler colonialism, locally and globally. She earned a Bachelor's of Science in General Science, emphasis in biology and anthropology from the University of Oregon. You can follow her on her Twitter, which hopefully I can share as well. Yes, at Melanin Muskogee, remember, MVSKOKE, which also has her link tree and a bunch of great links on there that I hope you will check out. So I just want to say we truly appreciate you both joining us, and I cede the floor to you both, or Dr. Mays, whoever wants to start.
Well, thank you, Reggie, for the wonderful introductions. Always good to share a platform with my comrade in struggle, Amber Starks. I always continue to learn so much from her, from all the things she writes, tweets, posts. So I'm always a huge admirer. So thanks again for sharing the platform. So let's get into it. And thank you to the audience out there. I'm sure myself and Amber never take these opportunities for granted. So very humbled to be talking to you all. So I contemplated a more formal presentation, and I was going to do that, but then I thought maybe the flow would just be better if I offer some remarks for a short time, and then Amber and I will engage in just like a conversation around the series of questions, and then hopefully looking forward to audience questions. So I think just way of background. So I identify as African American and Saginaw Chippewa, which is a tribe in sort of mid Michigan. My great grandmother came from the Saginaw Chippewa Reservation to Detroit in the spring of 1940. And she married an African American man who is my great grandfather. And she really raised nine Afro-Indigenous children and became a well respected elder within the city of Detroit, advocating mostly on issues around children's welfare. So, for instance, she testified before Congress in April of 1974 regarding what became the Indian Child Welfare Act, and which is currently under threat, right? And so, if you know anything about the act or don't know, go check it out. But very briefly, the whole point of the act and why it was implemented as federal policy was to keep Native children within Native homes and communities because Native people, children are being kidnapped out of their communities, and so that is currently under threat at the moment. And she is also very much connected and concerned with children's future within urban areas. So if you remember nothing that any of us say here today, remember that a large majority of Native peoples live in some urban context, right? That doesn't erase or ignore, and many of us continue to have relatives that live on the reservation. We often call it res, right? I still have cousins, aunties that live on the res. So many of us grew up, at least since the post 1970s, grew up in a variety of urban spaces, still have family, go back and forth. But so some of the work I did in Afro-Indigenous history. Oh, let me finish the previous slide. So The importance of that is to say that her daughter, Maya Judy, founded what was a third ever public school in U.S. history with a Native American curriculum called Medicine Bear American Indian Academy. And this was in the early 90s, and it was very much supported by Black politicians, educators in the city of Detroit. Right, so Detroit was in the 1990s and remains the blackest city per capita in the U.S. And the whole point of the school was to have an educational space, a safe space where Native children, Afro-Indigenous children, people of mixed heritages or multiple Indigenous heritages were their identities, cultures, and histories were affirmed within a particular space. And even when I meet activists today in the city, hip hop heads, artists of many sorts, they still have a lot of love for Maya Judy for making that a very safe space. And we need to continue to find spaces like that. It's no longer in existence, but we need certainly more spaces that affirm the complexity of youth identities and help them develop. Now, I wrote An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States, and I tried to do a few things within that book. First, it was really to talk about the relationship between settler colonialism, and for those who don't know, it's simply when Europeans came over, took land from indigenous peoples, said that and displaced them, and then settled there. Right. The other component of that are these sort of signs, narratives, and symbols used to continue to justify why Native people's land should have been conquered and why they deserve to be displaced. And the exercise I often use with my students is two things. Think about where you grew up and what do you know about the local indigenous population? Right? And even if you didn't grow up in the US, there is an indigenous population somewhere where you live, right? And just pause and think about that for a second. What do you know? And what do you don't know? And if you don't know, it's certainly not your fault, right? But that's the process of how settler colonialism works. So you can continue to ignore and disengage with the fact that a particular form of genocide happened and is continuing to be justified against indigenous peoples. And so the relationship between white supremacy and settler colonialism. And you only get like 85,000 words. So it's a very limited space to talk about, some 400 years of Black and Native history. And the other part of that is looking at some of the founding documents. So things like the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and looking at how a young nation was very much concerned with what they called the Indian problem at that time. What do we do with Native peoples who continue to live and don't simply go away or disappear as we thought they would? Right. So I'm not going to give a whole lecture of 19th century U.S. history and democratic institutions, but I will say there are two foundational parts to understanding U.S. democracy. That is the dispossession of millions of indigenous peoples from their lands and the enslavement of millions of people of African descent, right? That is foundational to our understanding of US democracy. And their continued impacts continue to shape US democracy. I mean, there was a whole big election yesterday, right? And so those things persist well into the present. And I try to show also collaboration. So you often we think of these particular histories as not very much intersecting. In other words, just because Black people are oppressed and Native people are oppressed, they're oppressed very differently. And I want to acknowledge that there are some fundamental differences. So we typically think about these in terms of Black people were enslaved, found their freedom, and tried to integrate into US democratic institutions of society, although constantly met with white racial terror, violence, segregation, all sorts of inhumane things happening to them. And for Native peoples, in many ways, they just wanted the United States to honor the treaties. So one of the key difference between Native peoples and all other racialized and minoritized groups is that they have a treaty relationship with the United States. Now, I also want to acknowledge that there are many nations who are unrecognized, like I'm in Los Angeles, and it's the historical territory of the Tonga Gabrielino. And while they initially had some treaties and discussions, it was ultimately not recognized. But that doesn't invalidate for me that these are indigenous peoples and this remains their homelands. And we should recognize and honor that. And I tried to show also solidarity. So one of my favorite examples is someone who I'm sure many people in the audience would know is Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture. So in my analysis of history, he was one of the first, or not first, but one of the only African Americans at the time, or people of African descent, who very firmly stated that this was not his or Black people's lands, but indigenous lands. And so I use his example to show what solidarity could look like between Black and Native peoples and what this could look like going forward. And I think, and I'm sure Amber and I will talk about it a little bit later, but we're always really invested in understanding the future. You can talk about Native peoples in the past. Some talk about many of us in the present, not a lot, but some, but we're very much invested in the future. And then I try to think about ways of where we can coalesce and using Audre Lorde, the queer Black feminist and author of the essay Learning from the 60s, when she articulates anything worth doing around coalition must be difficult and not easy to achieve, and the importance of not assuming just because we're both oppressed that we are natural allies, right? We often assume that. Um, Finally, the book tried to respond to a few different myths. So one of my favorites that comes from some of our Black folks is the Indians enslaved Africans. Yes, there were five tribes who engaged in the practice of enslavement, and they had also been engaged in various forms, many tribal nations, various forms of slavery, but it wasn't in the same way as chattel slavery. And the five tribes adopted this. They were trying to protect their land. I mean, what a way to show civilization to the United States. There are other things that they did too, creating a Cherokee syllabary and so forth. But those are the tribes, and some are dealing with this better than others to well into the present. And there's some issues there, but that was not every tribal nation. The other thing is coming to terms with the reality of the Buffalo Soldiers, right? I didn't talk about them explicitly in the book, but it was in the back of my head around there have been kind of terrible things that have happened historically amongst various Black and Native peoples, communities, individuals. And if we don't really talk about it, address it, think about it, we really can't move forward. Right? You can't deal with trauma without talking about it very explicitly. Um, and I think I'll end here, but I think finally it's important to have a conversation about contemporary issues, focus on reparations and the contemporary land back movement. Now, I'll say this plainly, as an Afro-Indigenous person and having Black relatives whose ancestors were kidnapped, and they were, coming from Indigenous communities themselves. If white supremacy and settler colonialism ended tomorrow, and I hope y'all would agree with me there, I'm not getting rid of those people. I'm not getting rid of my relatives, because I want to live in a world free of colonialism and its issues, free of anti Blackness, free of anti Indian sentiment and actions. So, if we're to have a real just conversation around reparations and a return of land, we can talk about things like 40 acres and a mule or Black Wall Street, although everyone tends to ignore in Black Wall Street that it was allotment land and that uh, it wasn't every Black person, it was just wealthy Black people. They always tend to ignore the poor, and working class people in Tulsa at the time. That's a whole nother conversation that I didn't even think I was going to get into, but we have to think about how we can talk about these sort of conversations in tandem. Otherwise, if Black people got reparations, so like the phrase, when Black people are free, all people are free, right? I think the Kabahi River Collective had a different idea of what that meant. And so I think they would be invested as Black radical socialists, would have been invested in indigenous liberation. That has kind of morphed into a focus and a legitimization of US democracy in a particular way, or the what is a settler colonial state. So I'll stop there. And I'll pass it over to Amber if you just have any initial thoughts. Want to introduce yourself to the people again?
Sure. Hesche everyone, Amber Chehochefkados, Muskogogi Does, Lashtogi Does, Amalegida, Lojagoga Moma Amatoa, Lojapoga. Hi everybody, my name is Amber. I am Muskogee. My tribal town is Lojapoga, or the place where turtles dwell, and my clan is the Turtle Clan. And I'm very much a proud Black woman of African American heritage. And like Kyle said, I'm honored to be here on this panel sharing space with Kyle, who is someone I very much admire and look up to and learn from. And always just feels really grateful to be in conversation, because I think we're like-minded. I think we challenge each other. I think, like you said, we're both futurists. Not that we ignore present struggle or the seeds that our ancestors planted, but we're really interested in preparing fertile ground for an actualized, like authentic, liberated Black future and sovereign Indigenous future. And so, I had the pleasure of reading Kyle's book before it even came out, which was a huge honor. And I learned so much. I think it definitely stretched even my political views and helped me grow politically. And even challenge the way I speak to Black and Native relationality, or is that a word? I don't know. But anyway, you get my point. But I think that there's this constant idea that Black and Native people exist in opposition to one another, and we don't, right? Like, we are both peoples who are navigating white supremacy, settler colonialism, racial capitalism, all the other isms that intend to commodify, destroy, and harm and violate Black and Native peoples, not just within this generation, but in perpetuity, like forever, right? Settler colonialism is an ongoing process, hence ICWA. So if you didn't know, today the Supreme Court heard a case around the Indian Child Welfare Acts and Indian Native nations being able to care for our children, keep them in homes, even in instances where they need to be taken out of their primary familial homes. And so ICWA is for me, is another example of the ways in which settler colonialism seeks to, at least in the context of the US, and we could speak broadly, but I think that Kyle and I are trying to speak specifically to what is known as the US, is this ongoing process of, kill the Indian, save the man, right? Like that whole idea that Native people are savages, that we are incapable of self-governance, autonomy, and self-determination. And so I think that Kyle's book does a really great job of laying out the historical context of the work that many of us, not just Kyle and I, but so many of us are trying to speak to futurity, but we're also trying to mitigate the harm that has happened in the past and what's happening currently. So Native folks, Black and Native folks, Black folks, we're all trying to get free, right? And so it's important that we don't place our movements in opposition to one another, but that we speak to, what it is that we're really trying to achieve individually and collectively. And for me, that is a reminder that we have a mutual oppressor. We live in a society that wants to erase and dispossess and genocide Native folks and commodify, and I would even say destroy Black folks when we no longer can be domesticated under these ideas of settler colonialism and white supremacy. And so I just want to say that I'm looking forward to this discussion. I think I'm also looking forward to the questions from the audience, because I feel like we always get really brilliant questions from people who are really interested in how we go forward, how we have a present and a future that recognizes Indigenous sovereignty, but doesn't erase the legacy of Black folks in this country. And so how do we do this work that doesn't uphold settler colonialism in the settler state, but also repairs the real damage that has been done to both of us, both of our peoples, the tangible, material changes that both of us are deserving of, both of our peoples are deserving of. And how then do we build kinship? How do we live on this land together? How do we live on Indigenous land together where all of us are free? And again, I think that we can, like you said, Kyle, this is hard work. This is what we mean when we say decolonization, right? We have to undo this very messy, ongoing situation. And how do we do that work when we don't like each other? How do we do that work when we harm each other? How do we do that work when it doesn't seem possible, right? This is hard stuff, but it doesn't mean that we're incapable of getting there. And I always like to remind folks that we are more genius than our colonizers, than our oppressors. We have always been the architects and the authors of our liberation. Our ancestors planted seeds so that we can reap and continue to plant seeds for our descendants to harvest. But I want to remind us that we also have a responsibility to pick the weeds of our oppressors, because they're also planting seeds, right? So with that, let's get into it. Not that we haven't already, Kyle, but let's get into the questions, let's get into conversation.
Let's do it.
All right, peace. Let's see, as I came on, I had a question I was going to ask, but I do see that we have a question here in the chat if y'all want to address that. I'll read it out here. This is from Ariel, if I'm pronouncing that right, but this might be a oh yes, it says, whenever I have conversations and reflections on freedom and what that looks like for Black and Indigenous peoples, I find myself reflecting on the process of reformation versus transformation. I believe in transformation and abolition, but I can't comprehend the reality of that happening. I would love your thoughts. So whoever might want to address Ariel's question / comment.
I mean, I don't have any like a step-by-step kind of answer, but one, the question is fantastic, right? So you always have to begin with important, very deep questions. I return to history always as a kind of an initial starting point. Literally understanding kind of what happened. And I think the most important part is, how do we center land? And I don't mean private property, but how do we relate to land, other non-human species? And how do we imagine human and non-human species belonging to particular places, right? Because if we don't center that, I mean, again, you can have, I wouldn't say it was complete. You can have some form of liberation, Black liberation, for example, without thinking very carefully about land. But then you just become a settler colonial project and reproducing that on indigenous peoples, right? And so this is why I always say, how do we center land and the belonging of people forced to come here? And while that's not the point of this conversation, there are people continuing to be forced to come here because of the United States' neoliberal policy. So, indigenous folks from Central and South America, for example, who are displaced, of course they wouldn't want to leave their homes, but they're kind of forced to do so. And what do we do also with those people as well? So my starting point is to ask more questions, and to keep what my colleague Robin D.G. Kelly says, keep the freedom dreams going. Because if you don't dream of freedom, we're not really going to accomplish anything.
Yeah, I think the only thing I really have to add to that is I want to remind us that our imaginations are not constrained by like our oppressors' ideas of what is capable, right? Sometimes I think about people probably told Harriet Tubman, other freedom fighters, like what was capable in their time period. Like, you'll never be able to, we'll never be free. You'll never get to, the promised land or the North. You're setting people up for getting caught, right? Like I could imagine the things that people were telling her, what was capable in her time frame, like in her time. And I can imagine that her imagination was grander than the parameters set on her by her oppressors, right? And by just by the slave industrial complex, that Black people would never be free, that we would never see a time where Kyle and I can have a conversation, like this is probably even grander than she even dreamed. But I just think about the ways our ancestors thought about what was our actual inheritance, right? What we were deserving of, and knew that we were capable of achieving things outside of a settler colonial idea of what was for us. So I think that let's imagine as big as we want, and then let's try to get there. Let's try. The boundaries are the ones we set on ourselves. And that's not me saying let's not be realistic. We can be honest about where we really are. We can talk about the challenges that really exist. But, I also think about, I say I'm a budding abolitionist because I'm still learning. I'm still trying to figure out what that means. I think the, prison industrial complex is a evolution of the plantation, right? That the plantation didn't go away, that it still exists in these different forms. And so abolition, the idea of like not having prisons, not having this like carceral state, then what do we do with all these problems? It's good to question what do we do, but it doesn't mean that we don't do it, right? And so that's what I think about, reformation versus transformation. Things do transform, they do change. If they didn't, I wouldn't be here speaking to you. I wouldn't be here existing as a, fully Black and Native person with self-determination and autonomy. So I want to encourage us to not be bound by the imagination of our oppressors, because their intent is that we don't go forward, is that we remain as subjects to their pleasure, right? To their system. So let's dream big.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you both for as well, thoughtful and answers. I did want to take just a quick step back. I know we're going to definitely dive back into a few things, but I do want to ask Dr. Mays, just, what, or who inspired you to write. If anybody just joining us, Dr. May's book again, Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. So
there, like any thing that's kind of produced or put out in the world, whether an art piece, dance choreography, a rap track or whatever. But I was always frustrated as a reader and as an Afro-Indigenous person. I'm like, where's kind of a more holistic look at U.S. history through the experiences of Black and Indigenous peoples? And all of the books that I had read, or at least a large majority on this topic, were concerned with the five tribes. And that makes sense because of the issue of them enslaving people of African descent and the ongoing issues that go all the way up to Congress, to Indian country in present day Oklahoma and other parts where, um, the freedmen continue to have, and many Afro-Indigenous peoples continue to have issues, and both being recognized as citizens, reconnecting, and that is an important issue. But there's a lot of stuff out there and a lot of wonderful people doing that sort of labor and have been doing that labor for decades now. I mean, centuries at this point. And so I was like, well, I'm also interested in structures in a certain way. How can we talk about something very critically about US democracy, American capitalism without and seeing its impact on Black and Indigenous people? And so I was like, well, Kyle, you can write a book. You have the capabilities to do so. And it's a part of a wonderful series, for those who don't know, called Revisioning American History. And there are other fantastic books in this particular series as well, done by Beacon Press. And so that finally, it was my attempt to think about Black and Indigenous past, presence, and where we might go. Whether I accomplish that is up to the readers, but that was my attempt to do so. And also just trying to make the communities I'm connected to proud.
that's great. Thank you. And on that, Sister Starks, I do want to ask also, I guess I'm thinking of, what scholarship is out there. Do you feel there's just a void that this book sort of, it's like, this is what I've been waiting for, because I think when I saw the title, I know I thought of, I think Howard Zinn's book, which I will probably be reading for the rest of my life, chapter by chapter. But just seeing this particular title in itself just excited me, because I'm like, yes, this is what we want to, to center that history. So, and then Sister Starks, if you have any additions to just your thoughts on the book or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as an Afro-Indigenous person, just being seen, I think the book made me feel seen, because there isn't a lot of scholarship out there that speaks specifically to the Black and Native experience, but also speaks, specifically to both of our peoples and how we got to where we are, like why there are freedmen who are not seen, right? Like, I belong to one of the, I'm a citizen of one of the five tribes, and understanding the ways in which Native peoples, specifically the five tribes, felt that they had to, what they had to do in order to be seen by the settler state and not destroyed, right? But then the effects that had on also, our Black relatives, our Black ancestors. And I'm not a descendant of freedmen. And if anyone doesn't know who the freedmen are, they are Black folks who were owned, enslaved by one of the 5 tribes, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, Choctaw, and my tribe, the Muskogee Creek. And so today their descendants are fighting, I would say 4 of the 5 tribes are fighting to be seen and recognized as citizens of their nation. So the Cherokee Nation recently amended their constitution so that they could welcome home their freedmen kin, right? And so I think this book, along with a couple other books, I have some books that are on my floor that I have been reading. So excuse me for a second. In addition to Kyle's book, of course. There's some other really good books that speak to, Black and Native identity, or like the history of how we got to places where we, I say, disenfranchised Blackness from indigeneity, not just here in the States, but globally. I've really been interested lately in speaking to, wanting to know how the racialization of Black folks is meant in a lot of ways to disenfranchise us from the idea that we're capable of being Indigenous, right? Or that there are Black Indigenous people all over the world. And so I think, along with Kyle's book, there are people who are trying to write and tell the story, make the stories of Black and Native folks and our relationship to one another in this country, in the context of this country, visible and heard. And so I think it's so timely, especially, after the, with Black Lives Matter and with all of the things around 2020 when we're in our homes and we're trying to talk about like how we go forward. How do we have a future that is outside of this mess? I think having scholarship like Kyle's book and these other books gives us a chance to reframe the histories and understandings of Black and Native folks in the US. And also, I think globally, think about the ways in which imperialism has harmed Black, Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples worldwide. So I know I'm grateful for it. I know I was excited reading it. I felt like I was like live texting Kyle for the first couple chapters, and I was like, he probably like, girl, leave me alone. But I was just so excited to like be seen and just to have the context of things that I know. And I'll also say it gave me a lot of language for the things that I was thinking and wanting to express, but maybe didn't have like deep historical context. So I think Kyle does a really good job of giving us history in a way that's accessible. And there's so many of aha moments like, oh, of course, yeah, that's why this is why it is. And so, I can't praise it enough because I just think it's a really well written book. And the one thing I told Kyle is that I love the language. I feel like whether you are highly educated or, academia is not your thing, or you would prefer to use like slang or, AAVE over, whatever we want to call what we say English is. I just felt like, it was like him and I talking, having a conversation. It wasn't pretentious. It isn't pretentious. It's super accessible and it's funny. It's really funny. There are just times where I was just like laughing. And again, I just felt like a conversation. It felt like this conversation that we're having now. So I hope you all read it. And yeah, there are so many other resources out there that talks about like how we get here, but this is one of my favorite books. So
that's great. Thank you both. And I see a question in the chat. I did want to kind of, and maybe even just for people who may have joined in a little late, kind of got like a couple just quick soft questions. So, one is, because sometimes we like hear these terms and it's like to us, they click, but just someone who might hear the word Afro-Indigenous and say, what does that entail, encompass? So I don't know if it's a way to succinctly define that, but, either whoever wants to take this, just how, or I guess who, would you define Afro-Indigenous?
I'll be very succinct. So it refers to two things. One, how people kind of personally and politically, a political identification and a personal one.
Mm.
And there are other terms too that, at least in my family, continue to use, but like publicly and in academic or activist spaces, generally Afro-Indigenous. And the other part for me is understanding the relationship and connection between Black and Indigenous communities. So there's like a kind of a high political, social, economic way of viewing how these particular diverse communities connect, overlap, and also disconnect.
Yeah, I mean, I think my only thing to add is that I think it's a term that I think is more formal. I think back in the day, our grandmothers, grandfathers used to say they're Black Indians or Native and Black, right? I think language evolves over time where people are trying to find better ways to convey and represent themselves. But Afro-Indigenous being, one of the terms I feel like this generation is using to legitimize the fact that Black and Native people who are both Black and Native exist.
Mm-hmm.
But there are folks who don't relate to that term. They will just say their tribe, they will say that they're Black and Muskogee, something like that. And so I always want to give space for those of us who exist as both of these people to use whatever term that best, conveys who they are. And so it definitely is a personal choice, but I think it has kind of been the common term that we've all been using as a way to not just validate, because I think we're valid, but a way to like recognize, like formally recognize that, people who are both Black and Native exist, and that we have existed, right? There are people who are multi-generational Black and Native, right? Not just, what we would say is like biracial, half and half or whatever. But there are people who have been Black and Native for multiple generations, and that's as legitimate as anyone who is, maybe they're the first generation Black and Native.
Yeah, and Amber, it's probably true for you, but and it's kind of generational in my family. And if I'm around family, I might use it, but they still use Indian. That doesn't, and in their personal, they use in one sentence they might be Indian, the other sentence they might be Black,
Yes, right.
and it's not a contradiction for them at all. I mean,
Yeah,
I still do it to this day.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's such a, even when I asked my grandma, she says she's Indian. Her dad was also, Black and Native, but and that's not, she's not erasing or
Yeah,
compartmentalizing her identity. She's Indian, right? And so even when I asked her that, I was shocked. I don't know what I expected her to say when I said, well, how do you identify? Because I thought she was just going to say she's Creek, but she's like, she says she's Creek, but she will say she's Indian. And
yeah,
I know she's very much also proud to be Black as well, right?
yeah.
So I think it's just like the term a lot of us are saying we're Native, right? Like the generation before us would say they're Indian, right? And so there's this kind of, people are trying to change the language to make it so, they want the language to not center the settler state, but I don't think that our grandmothers are centering the settler state when they say they're Indian, right? They're very much proud to be who they are,
That's great. Thank you both. And that actually, and yes, Q&A, I still see you. I'm gonna just run through one something that my colleague was asking about, and y'all did touch on it actually with the prior answer, but she, wanted to know what identifiers, phrases are acceptable or any potential that are problematic. And, I think I've definitely heard conversations where someone will say Indian and then you correct it and they say, oh, Indigenous and so forth. And then I think she just put four here, for example, First Nations, American Indian, Native Indian, Black Indian. It sounds like it's fluid, but any like additional thoughts, I guess, to the last or to that?
You asked 10 different people depending on generation, where they grew up. You're gonna get 10 different answers. I mean, I think and Amber mentioned it, you kind of just give space and just ask people, like you might ask pronouns, like, hey, like, how should I, describe you in that particular way? And personally, I'm cool with all of them. I don't care at all, because I've been referred to them as all, and none of them are particularly offensive to me. But I would encourage people to ask people, and if you don't know, I might err on the side of indigenous.
Yeah. I was gonna say, just don't say, and if you're not Native, don't say Indian. I think there's a lot of Native folks who won't even say, they won't write out Indian, they'll write out NDN, like the letters, as a reclamation of that, because for them it feels derogatory. But I'm with Kyle, and especially if you're in a relationship with somebody who is Native, I feel like you should have at some point like already have asked that or have known that. And if you haven't, now's a good time. But I think all of those are interchangeable. And like Kyle, none of those offend me. I don't, if somebody said I'm Indian, I wouldn't be like, how dare you? But I do think that there are some people who are like, we all are in different spaces in our politics and our understanding of self. And so I just think it's to be cautious. I would say Indigenous is the safest. But I also, I've been thinking about this a lot, about how we use Indigenous as interchangeable for Native American. And so then when people globally speak to being Indigenous, people are, their context, like they're not able to like open up and realize like Indigenous is a global term. So Indigenous is absolutely a global term, and anybody Indigenous to any place in the world has a right to use that term. And I think that sometimes, like even when I say, Black Indigenous people or, Black African, Black and Native folks are Indigenous to the Americas, there will be pushback from people who their first response is that Black people aren't the original peoples of the Americas, right? Like there's this whole idea that Blackness can't be Indigenous to any place in the world. And so I think for me, I just want to make sure that people know that Indigenous is a global term and that there are people who use it interchangeably, especially here in the US. Yeah. But it is not specific to Native Americans, people who are Indigenous to the Americas.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you both again. Let's see. I'm gonna skip over a couple I have that I'm anxious to ask, because I do see hopefully I've got the name in the chat right, Kira. And just a reminder, folks, for anybody tuning in, hey, thank you very much for joining us for this wonderful program, our awesome guests I'm excited to build with right now. Please, if you have any questions, you can throw them in the chat or in Q&A. I will find them and I will try to get to them. So we've got one here from Kira. And for this question, it says, so we're gonna get a little heavier again. How would you address a situation in which there are Black people contributing and participating in a space founded by non-Indigenous people, that's in parentheses, which perpetrates and harms Indigenous people through ongoing acts of misrepresentation and stereotypes? Where would you start having this conversation of solidarity when one group is participating in harmful spaces that negatively impact the other group? So it's kind of towards the end of that question there, clarifies it.
Well, the first thing is back to none of us are natural allies. So the question is, how did they come to think that that was okay, right? And going back to what I said earlier, the whole point of settler colonialism is to take land, but it's also to continue a miseducation, right? And so people often, because the older you get, you just become more gracious. You don't know what you don't know. You can be offended on the one hand, absolutely. But because of how erasures work, many people don't know. So the first point is to try to be kind, loving, especially these are people you know. If you don't know, maybe that doesn't work. And you just try to talk to them and be reasonable. And then finally, all skin folk and kinfolk. So you have to find people that go with your particular political ideology as well. And just because you're Black or whatever, that doesn't mean you can't perpetuate racist stereotypes or colonialism.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I feel like I've learned the hard way, both of those, like, skin folk and kin folk, and that not everybody is a part of your community, right? I think we talk about building community a lot, but I think that there are people even who look like you, who come from communities like you, whose political ideas you are not necessarily in sync with. And so I love that Kyle mentioned, like, not everybody is for actual liberation. Not everybody is for not harming other people. I think a lot of times some people are willing to, some people's liberatory practices are at the cost of other people. And for me, that's not authentic liberation, right? If I'm willing to throw another group of people under the bus, in order to get free, then I'm not really going to be free. And yes, there are people in trying to achieve Black liberation are willing to throw Native people under the bus. And I think for me, the initial response, like Kyle would say, is to like convey like my feelings around it. Like, y'all, I'm having some concerns about the work that we're doing and how that's harming other people. Like, if we as Black folks are trying to do this work, we have to consider how we're perpetuating the very harms that we say that we're against for other people, right? So we want to get free, but is our freedom costing another group of people oppression? And so again, I think that that's best done when you're in relationship with someone or in relationship with a community. But if you're not, I mean, I think the best thing to do is to tell the truth, right? I think that's one of the things that social media gives us a chance to do. If we can't direct it at a person, we can get online and express our frustrations, right? Like, I see these things happening and I see how it's harming other communities. I think we should be having these conversations, right? I think that that's what a lot of folks are using their platforms online to do, is to address issues that maybe that they don't feel comfortable doing it directly. But if you're a person who feels like you can be direct with a person, I feel like Kyle said, come with compassion. Like, I'm really concerned about where this is going. I'm really concerned about how this is perpetuating the very harm we're saying that we're against, and that our movements of freedoms can't be at the cost of other people, right? Like, this is all intersectional work. We all have a mutual oppressor. And if we're uplifting any of that oppressor's agenda, we're not really going to be free ourselves.
Yeah, and we don't want to perpetuate carceral logics either. Like, I'm not invested in punishment,
Mm-hmm.
right? And as Amber was saying, if we're truly invested in liberation, it takes a lot of hard work to deal with issues,
Mm-hmm.
right? Some of us just need to go to therapy first.
Seriously.
Some of us need to go to therapy as like a starting point too.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Were you?
No, I was just agreeing. I definitely think that a lot of us, it starts with like dealing with our own stuff, right? And liberation work, I think, always starts with us dealing with our own stuff. And I think also interrogating our own politics, interrogating the reasons why we do things, interrogating our values, right? And I think knowing your values and knowing the people you're in communities values with is really important, because there are definitely things that people are going to disagree with, but I think overall, there are people who I know I don't want to be in community with, and that the liberation work that they're doing is harmful. And so, again, I can speak in generalities and be like, I don't, this is my opinion about that, but I don't necessarily, because I'm not in community with them, I don't go after them, right? Like, because I don't think that I'm capable of holding them accountable, because we don't have real relationship.
All right, thank you both. And something I definitely want to touch on, partially jumping into it now. I do see the Q&A button lit up, so I'll try to get to that question. But I'm someone who I first of all, I'm here. The room I'm in is at Rutgers Newark, where so shout out to my Rutgers fam who've let me use the room here, not too far from the library. Christina, I don't know what to do without you. Some of my favorite lessons have been through popular culture and, you know, sort of that relationship, how that shapes these sort of ideologies for better or for worse, for better and for worse in some cases. So I do want to ask if both or either of your relationship with just sort of that imagery that can sometimes feed those sort of negative tropes and stereotypes, you know, what you've encountered in your research, you know, in film, television, music, anything to that effect. So whoever would want to take that, you know, just anything you've kind of, like maybe an arc you've seen, has it progress from the days of John Wayne, or are we just static and regressing? So
I don't believe in canceling anything except for John Wayne. John Wayne feels to be canceled. Anyways, the particular image, which is great for teaching and to thinking critically about, was in the fall 2016, the Washington football team, which has changed their name to the Commanders now, because billionaire corporations were saying we're going to pull our advertisements out. And there's also a lot of Native protesting for decades prior to that. You had all these Black men who played for the Washington football team. They had like the Black Power fist in their racist kind of Washington football uniform. Now, this is not a creation of theirs, and I want to make that clear. So I'm not blaming them. But the irony there is just fascinating. It's just fascinating. You're protesting a particular and real injustice, while at the same time there's these racist symbols existing in the same scenario. So Huey Newton said contradiction is a ruling principle of the universe, and that is quite a contradiction. And I think the other thing is talking about Native peoples in the past. And, and out of good conscience, people could easily just say genocide happened, this and that, instead of thinking about and seeing Native people as peoples of the present and future. And so to me, those are kind of two things that exist in popular culture that I wish we could really do away with. And finally, in instances of solidarity through popular culture, one of my favorite sports commentators, podcasters is Bomani Jones, African American man. And he went on a particular show and he had a Caucasian shirt on. And if you haven't ever seen the Caucasian shirt, it's a sort of parody of the Cleveland Indians emblem. I think they're now the Cleveland something else. Guardians, I think it is. And so people were upset. How could you do white people like this and so forth? And his point was, this is how Native peoples feel being mocked when you're doing this sort of thing. So it made a huge splash. And shout out to Bomani Jones for actually doing that, because it was funny, just because it's funny, but also made the political point that was worth doing. So, and those are the ways solidarity can look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think our ability to empathize with other people's struggle needs to mature. I think that's one of the things that settler colonialism and white supremacy has dulled in us, maybe. I don't know if that's the right word, but I think we need to we need to mature in our ability to be able to empathize with other people's struggles. I think the other thing is, I feel Native people, the imagery around us is that we're warriors and we're, these kind of tropes of that we are these kind of strong warrior types for athletics, right? And so I think when, Black folks who can wear Redskins jersey, but still, want to protest, police brutality. And sometimes there's like this conflict in their mind of like, well, I am celebrating you, right? Like I am honoring, this is a lot of things that we heard around like mascots. It's like, this is a way for us to honor you, even though Native peoples have been saying, this is not honorable. We're telling you how this makes us feel. And then that goes back to that ability to empathize, right? Like this doesn't make me feel like you're honoring me. We don't want to be the warrior trope that white supremacy has set up, only as a way of like, I think in a way it mocks Native people, right? I feel like there's a lot of imagery out there. And I think oftentimes with Native women, Native femmes, it's around sexualizing us, right? It's around seeing us as like fantasies and objects. Like I think a lot of femmes and, women and a lot of cultures, but I think when you think about, everybody knows her as Pocahontas, like the way that, the Halloween tropes of Native women are always these kind of sexualized, degrading ideas of Native women. And I think it contributes to the missing, murdered Indigenous persons, particularly women and femmes, that Native women and femmes have been, trying to counter, right? Like we become these like caricatures. We have become these caricatures through the process of genocide, through the process of erasure. What has been left over for our men, our masculine folks, is these kind of Indian warriors. And for women, it's been these sexualized tropes, right? And so I think that we do see this conversation progressing, but again, it's because Native people have been pushing up against it, right? Like we have been the architects of dismantling mascots, and it is Native women and Native femmes, Native trans relatives who have been saying this is unacceptable, and you're contributing to people, particularly non-Native people coming onto reservations and harming Native women and Native femmes. So do I think it's changing? Yes, but I think it's because Native people have been pushing back against it. And I do think with the George Floyd protests, so many other conversations were allowed to be had, right? Not just police brutality, not just violence against, Black folks, but I felt like Native people also felt safe enough to be vocal in a way that maybe there were some hindrances to that. But again, I want to always remind us that Native folks and Black folks have always been speaking to our issues. But I think that, us being at home during the pandemic, folks were being louder about like what's happening. And I think the issue with changing the name was put on a broader platform because we were kind of having these really hard discussions about so many things around race and racialized peoples.
And there's still the issue of and racism in the end zone, and then the racist tomahawk chop with the Kansas City Chiefs.
I know. So side note, I made this joke a while ago. You guys might not think it's funny, but I just think it's funny. So, I have encouraged Kansas City to just change their names to the Chefs. That way they can still use the chop as if they're chopping vegetables. Like, I mean, we could be creative here, right? Like, but I do think this is like,
I'm taking that, by the way. I'm taking that.
And then they can have like Chef Boyardee as their mascot and be like chopping. But
I have childhood trauma from Chef Boyardee. Why are we talking about
that? I think that this is about power and money when it comes to it, right? Like it is about settlers not wanting to settler and the settler state not wanting to address its the genocide of Indigenous people, like this whole project, right? Because to to have to say like we did something wrong means that there's a next step of correcting that, right? It's like, I think that there is this idea that settlers and settler colonial institutions have the power to decide what they want to do with Native and Black bodies. That is their inherent right, right? And as Native and Black folks, we are supposed to be co-conspirators in our own destruction, in our own erasure, in our own genocide. And I don't think that we ever have been willing co-conspirators. And I do think, like we brought up the 5 tribes, Kyle brought up the Buffalo Soldiers. I think people felt like they had few choices, but I think that we should be honest. Some people were human and just did really evil things, were greedy, and wanted power as well. And so I think we have to talk about power when we talk about things like the mascots, when we talk about any of these conversations. This is about power.
Absolutely. No, I love all that. I love the remix of the tomahawk chop.
It's not, it's the chop.
Yeah.
The Chef Boyardee chop.
Yes, yes. So bless. I want to. I see a few comments here. I do want to address just a sort of addendum to from my colleague Dale. Just more of a comment. The Washington football team only allowed African American players circa 1960, perhaps, because they had to by law. The land is federal property and discrimination was illegal. So they were the last to integrate. So just a comment there. On an order with the other 2 I'm seeing. Someone just asked, Gregory asked, what are your thoughts on the book, The First Americans Who Were African, revised and revisited by Dr. David Imhotep, if either of you are familiar with that or have any thoughts on it?
Never read it. And was that just a general question or anything out of the book that seemed interesting?
Yeah, as far as it looks like it's just that the general question there. So just assumed if you, maybe something we'll all look up afterwards.
Can I say something? I haven't read this book. There's a couple books out there that that maybe assert or try to create this narrative that like African Americans are the original peoples of the Americas, that we weren't brought here by the slave trade, through the transatlantic slave trade, and even some people go as far as to say that like we're not African. And I don't know that that's what this book is saying, because I haven't read it, I haven't even heard of it. But I just want us to be cautious of that narrative. I think it perpetuates the erasure and the genocide of Indigenous peoples here who are Indigenous to this place, who have a genealogical relationship to the land. I also think it's disrespectful to our African ancestors who endured the violence of the slave trade, of the Middle Passage. I feel like there is this, like every cell in my body knows what my ancestors had to endure through the Middle Passage, right? Like there's this epigenetic, violence that's in my body, and to then tell my ancestors, like, you didn't endure that is very disrespectful, it's very violent. And so, though I have not read this book, and I'm not claiming that this is what this book says, I know that there are a lot of folks out there who have internalized this idea, and it is, like I said, it's disrespectful to our African ancestors, it's disrespectful to ourselves as their descendants, and it's also disrespectful to Native folks to perpetuate our erasure as Indigenous peoples. And I also want to remind folks, and Kyle said this earlier, that our African ancestors were indigenous to Africa, right? And to erase their indigeneity to African lands is also disrespectful. So again, I don't know if the person who wrote that question wants to expand, but I just want to caution us in kind of perpetuating these narratives, because we don't need to do that. Like, we don't need to create a history that harms both Black and Native people, because that's what I believe this, those narratives do. I think there's also, like, I'm very proud to be from peoples who survived both, the transatlantic slave trade and, the attempted genocide and stolen land, right? Like, I think that white supremacy wants Black folks to be ashamed of who we are and where we come from. And though this transatlantic slave trade and slavery were definitely horrible parts of our history, I'm not going to be ashamed of being Black. I'm not going to be ashamed of being descendant of African peoples. I'm very much proud. And I think that is one of the best ways we can stand up against white supremacy and settler colonialism, is to be proud of the peoples we come from. So again, I don't know this book. I'm not saying what it says or doesn't say, but I do want us to be cautious of that narrative that erases Indigenous peoples. But I also want to remind folks that people like Kyle and I exist, who we come from both of those peoples, and we're legitimate both as African descendants and also as in Native Americans.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that, and very, very important message there as well. As happens with the best programs, time is just flying by. So I do want to thank, I see, well, of course, y'all, which I'm probably do a few more times before we close up, but this is a question that I planned on sort of getting to and closing with. I don't know if we got into enough of the history of that sort of solidarity, but sequel, always a sequel. So what I do want to address is, it's in tandem with a question I had from Nadia in the chat. I guess as succinct as could possibly put it. I mean, I know it's a much broader answer potentially, but what does building power and self-determination look like in your perspective for both Black communities and Indigenous nations in the so-called United States at this stage in empire and capitalism, both visioning and materially for steps ahead? And says, appreciate y'all.
Appreciate you. That's like a whole 800-page dissertation question. I mean, I think people are kind of doing the work, right, in local communities. I mean, think of a few of examples. People trying to build collectives, the use of mutual aid for things that might not impact us necessarily, but we all might contribute to. And I think there are many ways that people are just trying to survive, and I think initially that's one way. But if I could envision something in particular, two things. One, that we create spaces and sit down and talk and learn about one another, and that's multi-generational, right? Because having elders, young people to like just talk and learn and listen with some food, some seasoned food, by the way.
Yes.
Right. And respecting everyone's dietary restriction, getting multiple sorts of foods together. I remember one of my elders telling me that food and gifts always help, bring people together. And the second thing is, what can tribal nations do to incorporate, adopt whatever you have? So Anishinaabe people have a clan system and created subsequent clans for determining someone's role in that particular society. And many tribal nations have clans. And I'm Makwa Del Dim or Bear Clan. And Amber mentioned earlier being a part of the Turtle Clan. You have a responsibility to people in your clan. And so what kind of new things can we do? It doesn't always have to be based on something. What if it doesn't exist? Create something new then. How can we incorporate people of African descent into our various nations and under whatever our protocols are?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I mean, I want to remind us that we're genius. I want to remind us that we are dynamic, right? Like Kyle said, oftentimes we think of Indigenous people in the past, but we're very much still here. Many of us are revitalizing our ways of existing. And prior to contact, prior to colonialism, we had ways to address when new people came into our communities, right? But I think what Kyle said is really important is that first we learn about each other, because so much of what we know about each other comes from our oppressor, right? Comes from the settler state. And that information is often wrong, right? That information is about perpetuating a narrative of like the savior, the people who came to make us savages less savage, right? All that kind of stuff. And so I think education, but learning from us, learning from communities, having food that's seasoned is also really important. And I think, again, growing like empathy for one another, I think we have to believe each other, because I think that sometimes when we tell people our stories, we're like, nah, that didn't really happen, right? And it's like, no, we need to like hear each other and listen to the pains and the violence that we've all endured, even at the hands of one another. But again, I think that starts with like the individual doing that, like Kyle said, some of us got to go to therapy first so that we can even understand why we do and believe the things that we say. And I think building political power comes from being in relationship with one another, right? And so again, like who's in your community, right? And I think also not being offended by, like Native people wanting their land back. That doesn't have anything to do with like,
Right.
I think there's this idea that people think they're going to get evicted, right? But we're not landlords, right? We are, stewards. And so in stewarding, you understand that you don't own the land, but there is a responsibility. Like Kyle said, if you're in a clan, clans often dictate like what you do, like who you are, like what your peoples do, like what, some of my clan folks are the medicine man. Like my clan doesn't do that. So I'm not a medicine person, right? And so I think that we have to be open to new ways of existing that are not like the question asked, like not around capitalism, not around white supremacy, right? But we're gonna have to unlearn that stuff, and that's a process. I think that there's this rush to like get there, but I want us to understand that we can be patient in our learning and our understanding. And I think that will be hard as we're dismantling the systems that we're currently under. Like we're doing these things simultaneously, right? We're learning how to get free while we're trying to get free. And that's complicated. But we're deserving of the end result, right? That is our true inheritance, not white supremacy, not settler colonialism, not anti-Blackness, not genocide. None of those things are we worthy of. And so I think we have to tell ourselves we're worthy of something different, and then we work towards that. But I think political power, starts with a relationship.
So much, a lot of jewels. Just there's so much I'm carrying with me, and we can be patient in our learning. Just one of many that I want to carry forward tonight. Thank y'all both. I could do this. I don't know if y'all want to sit with me for 2 more hours, but I could certainly do so with y'all. And hey, the future is open, so would love to maybe try to do this again. So
shout out Rick. I didn't realize that was the homie Nadia doing fantastic work with the Indian Collective. So shout out to the Indian Collective.
Oh,
yes, I am going to embarrass you.
Yes, I'm Nadia.
Salute to Nadia. Thank you too. That question was perfect because it reminded me and set me straight. I was like, okay, this is the final question of the time. So thank you. So I just want to say, I want to thank, of course, our esteemed guests. We're honored. We appreciate y'all so much. I want to thank anyone who tuned in tonight. For anyone who might want to revisit this program, tell friends about it, share it, please keep an eye on our NEWARK, N-E-W-A-R-K, I know we say Newark Public Library YouTube page, where you can revisit many of our programs. You can also follow us on IG and Twitter at JBAR, JBAAR_MPL, and on Facebook, James Brown African American Room and Newark Public Library. I want to thank my JBAR colleagues, Alicia Grant and Austin Williams, for all their work and support, as well as my colleague and head of our Special Collections Department, Dale Colston. Last but not least, thank you to my American Studies, Rutgers fam, and Department of Africana Studies fam here at Rutgers Newark. You can follow them at RUN, all caps, @FAM, to see their programs, including some great ones still coming up for the remainder of Rutgers African American Week. Stina Strasburger, I think you're still there. I'm not sure how I functioned before meeting you. Probably not as well. So always honored, and thank you all. And I don't know, what do we say? Love, peace, soul, all that.
Hello.
Thank you all. Be safe. Take care.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Peace. All right. Peace.
Bye.